of 1812 gives us a great opportunity to look at that world of settler-indigenous contact in a very early stage of settlement here. And it really opens a window on First Nations in that time and what were they doing. And I wonder sometimes what they would have thought about the War of 1812. They would have heard about it, and they would have understood the conflicts between what they called the King George men, the British, and the Boston men, the Americans. 1812 through to the settlement of establishment of Fort Victoria, 1849, we have a period where Indigenous people are the vast majority of the population here. You know, the number of Europeans in the territory is minuscule, a few hundred up to maybe 500 or 600 at the end of that period. Tens of thousands, maybe even approaching 100,000 Aboriginal people at the beginning of that period. And the period around 1812 actually gives us quite a bit of material because we have a fort just established at the mouth of the Columbia, Fort Astoria, and a few forts up the Columbia River and spreading into the interior. So we have some great first-hand accounts of Indigenous life on the Columbia from that period. So I think we make the mistake of thinking that it was a sophisticated and civilized Europe that met an unsophisticated, uncivilized America. Each of those cultures were sophisticated in their own way. Each of those cultures had a rich set of spiritual practices. We get a sense of Indigenous people who were deeply engaged in a world that they couldn't separate spirit from secular. In their vision, these worlds were intertwined, as it was, I think, more for the Europeans in those days than it is now. Today we can make quite a distinction in our own minds and our own culture, but in the 1770s and 1812, Europeans were much more likely to see the secular world as being governed by divine rules, I guess, or divine activities. These First Nations stretching from the Columbia River up to Alaska all belong to a cultural group, Northwest Coast peoples, and I think the point to make about them is although they shared a lot of common culture, there's huge diversity amongst them. But one thing they did share in common was they were seafaring nations. They were all marine or maritime nations. Indigenous people could, over the course of a few months in the fall, gather enough salmon and other resources to last them a year, and so they would spend their winter in cultural activities. We also have a culture that's starting to feel the impact of Europe. So the period that of 1812, 1814 through to the mid-19th century, a really dynamic, interesting time as First Nations and settlers are coming to grasp with each other and trying to grasp the meaning of what that encounter is going to mean for them in the long term.